Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 36th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maria Csakseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative International Education at the University of Oxford. Before introducing our speaker today, I will attend to a few administrative points. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post it online on the Department of Education's YouTube channel in due course. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been invited to speak. If you would like to ask a question, I would like to ask you to use the chat function of the webinar. You can use the same function if you just want to share your thoughts, if you want an opportunity to speak. You can do that throughout the presentation as well as during the Q&A section. The earlier you put your question or a thought in the chat, it's guaranteed that you will have an opportunity to ask. Once the speaker finishes the presentation, I will invite you one by one to share your thoughts or to ask your questions. When I invite you, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, state your name and where you are from. Now let me introduce our today's speaker. This is Professor Emerita Marianne Larsen, joining us from Canada today. Dr. Larsen is based at the Faculty of Education at Western University in Canada. She works in the field of comparative and international education, as many of you joining here already know very well. She has a long-standing interest in the histories, theories, and methodologies within the field of CIE. Much of Marianne's work focuses on the internationalization of higher education. Many of you may know her book, Internationalization of Higher Education, an analysis through spatial networks and mobilities theories, which brings together her interest in post-foundational theories and global processes of higher education internationalization. Marianne has studied how higher education faculty are compelled to engage in transnational academic mobility as a part of their professional work. She has also looked at the barriers faculty face in their attempts to travel abroad for their work and the experiences of academics who are forced against their wills to engage in transnational mobility, such as refugee scholars. So she has done lots of interesting work around the internationalization of higher education. Marianne has also engaged with educational institutions in Canada and abroad. She serves as an elected public school board trustee for the fourth largest school board in the province of Ontario. And recently she collaborated with a university in Kenya to develop their internationalization strategic plan. Today's talk is titled Stretching Spatial Theories, New Ways of Thinking of Space and Time in Comparative and International Education. Floor is yours, Marianne.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me to speak here as a part of your global public seminars in comparative and international education. I'm honored. And thank you to everybody for showing up today to learn about and engage in some conversation about how we might, as comparative and international education scholars, use spatial theories in our work. I'm going to get my slides up here and hopefully this will work. Can I get a thumbs up to make sure that
Yes,
you can
it's
see my
fine.
slides? Great. Okay, so here we go. Before I start, I just would like to acknowledge the contributions and work and scholarship of Doctors Jason Beach and Wei Wei. Jason Beach is a longstanding friend of mine, and we've done a number of collaborations that have produced these articles that you see on the screen here. And they really have shaped my thinking about the use of spatial theories in comparative and international education research. Wei Wei is a former doctoral student of mine, and she was invited and participated in the research and the writing that led to the article published last year in the journal Comparative Education. What I will do today in this presentation is first outline briefly some older meta-narratives associated with Enlightenment thinking around space, place, and time. And then I will outline some of the key ideas associated with what we call the spatial turn. After that, I will talk about a set of spatial theoretical approaches that I think are particularly valuable for doing research in comparative and international education today, and what those look like in action. I'm looking forward to a conversation with you about how we can think about and use space and spatial theories in our research. So please do pop your questions into the chat, and we'll use those as a basis for discussion, for our discussion afterwards. So what you see here on this slide are a set of ideas associated with space and time that are modernist meta-narratives or conceptions of space or time that really were developed through the Enlightenment and still influence education today. I think that's a really important piece to think about. So I'll talk about these or refer to these as perhaps older notions, but keep in mind that they still are of influence in education reform today. So time is generally thought about as being linear, chronological, objective, and measurable. Time works as something that passes or runs infinitely from the past into our contemporary present, and from this present toward the future without any reference to the context in which it exists. And these kinds of ideas about time developed largely from the 16th through to the 19th century, and were based on the different scientific developments and the spread of technologies such as clocks, watches, and the ability to mark time by seconds and minutes and hours. And as I said, these kind of understandings of time still today influence the shape of education when we think about the linear development of the child, and learning is taking place along one path, one evolutionary linear path, and that there's like one way to learn. Those ideas about learning come from these modernist conceptions of time. So let's take a look at some ideas, modernist conceptions about space. In terms of modernist conceptions of space, we can say that space, in contrast to time, has been viewed traditionally as being fixed, immobile, and static. Please excuse the typo there, embarrassing. Space was largely conceived in a way that we might associate with the notion of place, bounded like a container and fixed and unchanging. And you can read the two quotes at the bottom of this page by Foucault that sort of exemplify some of the ideas that I've just talked about. So the spatial turn really began with the work of Foucault and another scholar called Lefebvre, who rejected those notions of space and time that I just referred to in the previous slide, in particular, the privileging of time over space. And they suggested, and this was their early work around the 1970s, that the organization of space and paying attention to space was really important and central to an industrial, globalized capitalist world. And since then, scholars in a whole range of disciplines that you can see listed here on the slide have engaged in ideas associated with the spatial turn. Lefebvre, interestingly, said space is too important to just leave to the geographers. And so that's a call for scholars across disciplines, mostly social science disciplines, including education, to make space for spatial thinking. So let's find out what the spatial turn was all about and what some of the key ideas were or are that are associated with this shift in thinking from space being fixed and a container in which things happen and bounded in a way. The first, and I would say the most important component of the spatial turn, is the idea that space is relational. Relational space emphasizes that space is created and made by the social relations and interactions within it. It isn't a fixed thing. It is something that is made up of social relations, human and otherwise. A relational conception of space is very, very helpful in making sense of things happening in a globalized world. This kind of perspective implies accepting that what we think of as the global is really that which is made and taken up in local settings. So the global is implicated with what happens in a place, a local setting. And I'm going to return to this when I talk about globalization shortly. The next key idea associated with the spatial turn is that space is socially constructed. It's not, as I said earlier in the last slide, just a container and with borders or boundaries around it, with things in it. It is made by those very things that constructed. It is shaped by social relations, connections, and interactions. And these include human activities, events, all social relations, and, as I will suggest later, relations and interconnections with the non or beyond human world. The next idea associated with the spatial turn is the idea that space is dynamic and fluid. It is not static. It's constantly changing and moving as the relationships within it change and shift. Space is always in a process of becoming, and that makes it particularly difficult to study. And then the last piece, the last idea associated with the spatial turn is that space is productive. The connections and relations within a space, within the space that one is studying, produce things. They produce identity, they produce knowledge, and they shape our understanding of the world around us. And that can be a highly political process. Let's take for a moment this seminar, the space of what is going on here. This seminar, this space is constituted by the people who are a part of the seminar. Me, the speaker, you, the listeners, the audience, the technology of Zoom, the Wi-Fi, the computers, the devices that you're using to log on, the time zones that we're crossing, the physical spaces that we each are existing in as we participate in this virtual space. All of those things together are the space of this seminar. And we can think about how that might look different or be different if I was in a room with you at Oxford University, which would be great, but I'm not. And how our engagement with one another, how the knowledge that is produced through this space may be very different. And so the components of this space right now are going to shape how things play out, the knowledge that's produced, how I think about myself as a scholar, and possibly how you think about yourself as a scholar, and the work that you do, that you engage in with the spatial theories. I'm going to now move to talking about time for a minute, because we can't forget time. In fact, once our first article, Jason and my article, was published in Comparative Education Review in 2014 on spatial thinking, we were critiqued for ignoring time. So we have engaged with time a little bit more. We've had the time to engage with time. So the spatial turn, I would say, does not mean ignoring time. It means privileging space, but not ignoring time. In fact, we need to think about time in relation to space, rather than perceiving time as being linear. As I mentioned earlier, time is viewed as changing and cyclical. And we can turn to Indigenous scholars, actually, and traditional cultures to think about the cyclical nature of time, and in some ways the spiraling nature of time rather than being linear. Time can be thought of as like a spiral and repeating itself in some ways. These connections between space and time don't give primacy to time at all, but illustrate together how thinking about time in conjunction with space helps us to understand what is produced in particular spaces. Rather than recognizing time as a side element to social life, as Atkinson writes, there's more to gain when we weave time into our explanatory accounts of spatial relations and education. What's next? Why now? And I just missed that slide, so I will go back there. Why now? Well, there's very good reason why we're talking about space now, and that reason is largely called globalization. The spatial turn is in very much a response to the contemporary reorganization of space and time, evidenced by many changes, political, social, cultural, technological, economic, that people generally refer to as globalization. And you can read a definition of globalization by David Held on the slide here. In addition to globalization as really characterizing our contemporary world today, we are facing a number of challenges that cross national, local borders that are listed here on this slide. And those kind of challenges or crises that our world face make it extremely important for us to use frameworks in our research that cut across borders and boundaries and look at the notion of space in a relational, productive, becoming kind of way. And so what does that look like? What are some examples of how we might engage with space in the globalized, crises-filled world that we live in today? First of all, I have to acknowledge that there has been, even before what we might call the spatial turn, a lot of research around space as an object of study. And what I mean by that is scholars who, for example, look at the organization of the classroom, teacher at the front, students in rows and chairs, and how that way of organizing the material space of a classroom shapes learning, shapes knowledge, shapes how the teacher sees him or herself as being in charge, shapes the students, shapes the understanding of students as being empty vessels of learning, the teacher sage on the stage kind of thing, dumping knowledge into the students. That is one way of thinking about what space does, what physical space does, and how the components in a classroom produce a particular kind of student and teacher and knowledge as well. I'd like to take that a step further, or at least like spend a little bit more time talking not about space as an object of study, but in addition, space as the actual framework, the lens that we use to make sense of the world, the educational world around us. And I'll focus on networks and connections, mobilities, movements and flows, an idea that I found out about 2 years ago and got pretty excited about, called social topology, and what it means to take into consideration the beyond human world. And so the question I ask, or we pose in our research, is what does focusing on these things enable us to do that we couldn't otherwise do or see in our research? What new ways of thinking and understanding does focusing on space afford us, enable us, provide to us? So the first approach that I would like to share with you and talk a little bit about is social network analysis. I will explain what this messy diagram on the slide means in just a minute. Social network analysis is an approach that focuses on networks, and it views social relationships in terms of a network theory that is comprised of nodes. And where you see on this diagram a square or a triangle or a circle, those are nodes that represent individual actors. Those actors, in this case, in this study, are human actors, but they could not be human actors. They could be material objects as well. And then the lines represent the relationships between the actors in the network, or what are called in social network theory ties, nodes, or links. In social network theory, the focus is on identifying the actors in a particular network and how they related to one another. So on this slide, this is a study by Roldan and Schupp about the spread of the 19th century spread of an educational practice that came out of England, which I'm guessing most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. It's the monitorial schools. It was a system that was used in the development of public education in the 19th century in the UK, and it involved having monitors teach children in a very large classroom. There's a lot more to it, but that's essentially what it was about. It's also known as Lancastrian, after the name Joseph Lancaster, who developed it, system. And it spread to many different countries and areas around the world. And this is a map of the spread of the monitorial school system in the 19th century to Hispanic America, South and Central America. And there were certain individuals that played a key role in that spread. And one of them was James Thompson. And I'm looking, you can see him on the slide. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but he's on the right side of the square. And he was connected to many other people throughout Hispanic America and institutions. The BFSS was the British, oh, somebody help me, I can't remember what it was. It's a school society in Britain that helped to build and develop schools in the 19th century. So all of these things, and these researchers mapped out all of the connections between, I got a cat meowing here to come in. He'll join the network, in the spread of the monitorial school system. What would it look like if they didn't use a network or spatial approach to doing this research? Their study would look very different. It would be much more linear, for example, and it wouldn't enable us to actually see the relationships and the connections between the different elements, people and otherwise, in this network. What social network analysis enables us to see are not only the relationships between the different components, but changes over time. And this is one of their maps, and they have many others to show how new networks developed, how new individuals and other actors got involved in the spread of this school system, and so on and so forth. I'd now like to talk a little bit about ideas of movement and particularly policy research. And I'm going to focus as an example on an article written by Steve Carney, the title of which you can see on the slide here. Carney is largely interested in the spread of educational policy reforms in a globalized world across different sites. And he rejects those modernist conceptions of space and time and binary frameworks such as local, global, here, there, and et cetera, et cetera. And he says they're not very useful for understanding and studying objects of study that move over time through globalization. And he even sees that the nation state is something that moves and is always transforming, and over time with different pressures, for example, and things that are happening in the world today. Contemporary globalization, according to Carney, is all about flows, but also about inconsistencies and contradictions. What Carney does is he develops a concept of policyscapes to move beyond thinking about what happens in one nation and comparing it to what happens in another nation in terms of education. And he uses this concept of policyscape to study three very different types of educational reforms in three very different contexts: Denmark, China, and Nepal. And through his, and if you've ever been taught in comparative education that you need to just compare apples to apples, he really challenges that idea in and particularly in a globalized world. And through his research, Carney shows that even though he's studying completely different settings and studying different kinds of educational reforms altogether, those settings are bound by a space that is very similar, a space characterized and shaped by the global knowledge economy. In all of those spaces, each reformers, educational reformers in each of those settings have been pressured to adopt best practices, accepted knowledge around basic education, school decentralization, school management, higher education reforms that kind of look the same, but get taken up in different ways in these settings. His research shows ways that transnational policyscapes are constructed and how it is global flows of knowledge that shape what go on in those local settings. Let me just turn to the last example on my slide here. Well, second last, so I'll have to speed up. Are we at 25 minutes, Maya? Thumbs up? Okay. So I'll talk briefly about social topology. It has its roots in the 18th century mathematical discipline of topology, which has to do with how shapes, how things, the property of a form of a thing, gets reshaped and reformed, but essentially retains its same property. So social topology was taken up later from these mathematical ideas, and it has two parts. One, that our cultures today have become more topological. We can measure them through lists and registers and tests and things like that. And that way of measuring social life has reshaped social life in and of itself. Due to time, I'm not going to talk any more about social topology because I would like to just shift to some concluding comments here. But hopefully in our conversation, we can talk a little bit more about social topology and how it engages with space and time and provides a way for us to be thinking about those two concepts in a globalized world. I mentioned earlier that I think also there's room for us to engage with the beyond human world, the natural world, the animal world, and our relationships and entanglements with the beyond human world. Iveta Silova has done a lot of work in this area, and she calls upon scholars to think about those relationships in our academic world, particularly with the crises that we face in the world today around the climate and otherwise. So to conclude, what I've tried to do in my research over the last 10, 12 years is, along with my colleagues Jason Beach and Wei Wei, is push comparative education scholars to think about space critically, relationally, productively in their research, and do that because we live in a world soaked in spatiality, a globalized world. So it makes sense to adopt frameworks that are well suited for the kind of world that we live in. By liberating space from its more limited, fixed ideas to thinking about space as being open, relational, and political, and open, relational, and productive is a more hopeful way, I would say, of seeing the world around us, and a more political way too. It's not just an academic exercise and coming up with new vocabulary, new terminology that confuses anybody who's not an academic. It's really a way that makes sense in the context of the world that we live in. Space can be a catalyst for change, and Yi Fu Tuan is a geographer that really was a part of the spatial turn as well. And he really talks about how space provides us with the possibilities to rethink our world around us, make sense of our world around us, and potentially be used to create an even better world for our students in our schools and elsewhere. I'll finish on that note and look forward to some questions from you and conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Marianne. Excellent presentation. I see one private message here at the moment, but I would like to encourage everyone who is in our virtual space to come forward, share your thoughts, and indicate if you want to speak. Here is Sarah Black, who wanted to share privately with me so others do not see that she really enjoyed the talk and she cannot join in at the moment because she's in a cafe. I will use my position as the chair and I will ask my first question, which is also a provocative question a little bit. I really liked, Marianne, your phrase of making space for spatial thinking. And in my own work, as I study mobilities, etc., of course, I think about space quite a lot. And I have one big main concern about spatial thinking, which I will share now with you, and we can chat about it. Hopefully others will join in as well. So I really like how spatial theories challenge fixed, bounded notions of space, and how spatial theories emphasize fluidity and relationality. At the same time, educational systems around us, educational institutions, methods we use, everything around us in education, all of these systems, institutions, policies, practices are deeply embedded in historical structures of power, in geopolitical hierarchies, economic inequalities, colonial legacies. To what extent does spatial perspective or spatial perspectives, to what extent do they allow us to critically interrogate these power relations in education? Sometimes I wonder whether the emphasis on networks, flows, sometimes whether they obscure these entrenched asymmetries, these inequalities and hierarchies. If you could tell us a little bit more how you see the ways to conceptualize and disrupt these hierarchies through spatial theories, would be really interesting to hear.
Well, those are great questions, Maya, and I have thought about those as well in my own research, which I guess before I started engaging in the spatial turn, have always engaged with power and power relations in the research that I've done. I certainly think that there is room for thinking about power and the impacts and effects of power in the case of schools on students and teachers and so on and so forth within a spatial theoretical approach. I would turn to the work of Doreen Massey, who is a brilliant spatial theorist. She wrote a book probably 20 years ago called For Space, and she really makes an argument for engaging with the politics of space and power within space. And I think what a spatial approach enables us to do is really visually see better how power operates. And often it's elusive, and we talk about the power of corporations, for example, or if we're studying the role of edu-business and private capitalists in influencing education. These are statements, but when you map it out and actually see those connections between those figures, Stephen J. Ball has done a lot of work in this area too, and his work is certainly and always has been shaped by thinking about power and how power works in educational settings. So I see there being many opportunities, many rich opportunities for studying and actually visually seeing the ways that power operates educational spaces, whatever those may be, whatever your topic of study is. And spatial scholars, scholars associated with the spatial turn. Bob Lingard is another one who's done a lot of work in spatial theories with his research on PISA and the OECD, and power is central to his work. So I do not see a contradiction between engaging in spatial theorizing and paying very close attention to the effects of power in educational spaces.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you very much. I will now turn to our chat because there are some questions coming in. The first one is from Priyanka Soni, who cannot join using audio. And she's asking, saying, my research looks at space and futures. I wonder if you see a relation between them and if you could share your thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. I find futures research so exciting, and I'm really pleased to see more scholars engaging in futures research. When I talked earlier about modernist conceptions of time being linear and evolutionary, and with the spatial turn, thinking about time in a different way, I would hope that scholars engaging in some way with educational futures adopt not necessarily a linear evolutionary understanding of time, but also an understanding of time that, how can I say, that makes us aware that that time flows differently in different spaces, across different spaces. I'm thinking about how educational systems are really framed by narrow notions of time, narrow notions of what is considered success, singular models of success. When we talk about PISA, for example, what is built into international assessments like PISA are ideas that there is one way to be successful at school. And I think educational futures work can challenge that. And I would hope to see more about that. And I would love to hear, you could, if you have anything you've written, if you would put it in the chat, or if you'd like to share that here, that would be quite exciting. I also know that the work that's come out of UNESCO around educational futures has also engaged with beyond human world. And I think that that is a very welcome shift in educational research and thinking about the role of education in addressing and responding to crises, pandemics, climate crisis, extinction, endangerment of animals. I think that that is a very important part of our thinking about educational futures. And finally, I'm very long-winded here, I apologize. The addition of the S is so important, because when we talk about futures as opposed to a future, we are, in doing so, acknowledging that there are many ways for us to be thinking about what the futures of education may look like in different parts of the world. And I think that that is an important shift, largely from the field of comparative education that historically has been very interested in best practices spreading around the world as if there's one best way to do education. And we know that's not the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Rayana Rahmatu, would you like to come in to ask your question? Okay, then Raina Ahmadu, we can read the question here. So the attendee is asking, my PhD has a longitudinal design, and I was wondering if you had any experience or suggestions around accounting for and exploring subjective time in its evolving and circular nature among participants' narratives.
I love that you have used the word subjective. In other words, acknowledging that time, and I would say space, are experienced differently by different people, and that is another important piece of the spatial turn as well. I have really been thinking about the power of image, and I'm wondering if there may be a way in your research to use imagery, whether that's mapping, something like social or network, you actually do drawings to show the changing ideas among your participants over time. I think that there's a lot of room in our field for using those techniques for summarizing our data. And it is always a challenge in doing any piece of research, doctoral or otherwise, because you have a fixed time that you have to submit something. But I think it's important to acknowledge within any piece of writing that there are changes that have occurred over the course of one's study, one's data collection, and also likely to happen afterwards as well. Again, images I think are helpful for illustrating that, and particularly when you have a longitudinal design. I don't know if that's possible, but that would be my suggestion. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. Let's move on to Atik Rehman. Atik, would you like to come in to ask your question? I'm surprised that I cannot see Atik. Okay, perhaps I can read out this question. Normally people come in to ask their questions. So today, probably people are busy or in noisy environments. So Atik is asking, Atik is from Pakistan, and his or her question is, how can social network analysis be applied to analyze power dynamics and influence in organizations or social movements?
Well, I totally think social network analysis can be used to do that. It's looking at the relationships between actors in a particular group, and it allows researchers to identify individuals or actors within a network who hold significant power and are able to exercise or use that power. So that image that I showed of the mapping of the spread of the monitorial school system, there was one individual, James Thompson, who had many different connections. And because of those connections, he had power and he could exercise that power. Social network analysis also enables researchers to see the positioning of individuals within a network or actors within a network, and how close and the degree to which they're connected to others. And that is a way of visibly showing their potential power to influence others. I would just as a side note say it's really very much concerned with power dynamics, social network analysis, but the assumption is that power is something that is held by an individual or an actor within a network and exercised by that actor. And it may be many actors. You could have a network that has a power that's diffused across different actors in the network, but it certainly, from my understanding, is a way of showing or illustrating the power dynamics within a particular network. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Marianne. Definitely, I hope the person is still here, or maybe if they left, they can listen to this later. Next question. comes in. Again, the person cannot speak at the moment, so I have to read it. I hope you can read my question. My name is Pravin, and I'm a PhD student at King's College London. In my study, I'm building a methodological design called technography. I would like to ask about social topology. What are topological transformations in education that you might have come across with the emergence of technology or technology corporations in governance of education? What are
Okay.
topological transformations? Okay, if you understand, that's good, because I'm not quite sure.
To answer that question, I'm actually going to go back to talking about what I didn't have a chance to talk about
Yes.
when I had the slide up about social topology. So thank you for the question. Let me just say a couple of things about this approach. I meant, so one of the social topology comes from a very complex mathematical understanding about about forms, mathematical forms. And if you remember the image that I had up on the slide, it is an image of something called a manifold. And the idea is that in geometry, you can bend and shape things differently, and they will look different, but their essential properties or essential form remains the same. And that's really key to topology. And so topology is interested in change, in shape, in change, and time. What happens to a thing, an object, over time? And in terms of education, I think it has a lot of, there's a lot of opportunities for how to use these abstract ideas to study how something moves from one place to another. And we have a long history in our field of research in policy transfer, policy borrowing, it goes by various names, and looking at an educational reform. For example, I remember reading years ago about a reform in Japan called lesson study, and then that moved to the United States and was taken up very differently from what it was originally in Japan. And so what social topology can help us to do is very carefully study what the movement of educational reforms, and I'm just looking at your question here, you're looking at technology in education, and how the basic idea, the basic form, the basic property of that reform, that educational practice or process, as it moves to another setting, changes. It looks different. And I'm glad I had the opportunity to refer to my doctoral supervisor, Robert Cowan, who in one of his many writings talked about when educational policies or processes or whatever, they move from one setting to another. He said, as it moves, it morphs. And that's exactly what social topology is really talking about. And so I would love to see more research that really digs down in terms of looking very carefully. And I think Steve Carney's research does that to some degree. He's looking at sort of neoliberal, globalized education reforms that in the three settings of the article I talked about, they look different, but they're the same thing. And I think that kind of research is very, very exciting when we're dealing with the morphing, the changing, and the reshaping of educational reforms over time, over space and over time. I don't know if I've answered your question. Hopefully I've given you some food for thought about social topology. Happy to share with you if you like after, or just write to me. My email address, I'll put it in the chat. I'm happy to share other writing about social topology, as well as other articles that I've come across with people doing research in that area. There certainly is emerging research in that area in comparative education. A lot of it, again, has to do with international assessments and the social topology of that kind of work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We still have a little bit of time. There's some thoughts here shared in the chat that Marianne probably you see. As it moves, it morphs indeed. And then some colleagues here at Oxford from the Reparative Futures of Education project. Exciting to hear your talk, which is lovely. So if anyone has thoughts or questions that you want to come in and share, that would be great. Please do come in, we still have time. So meanwhile, I could ask another question perhaps. So Marianne, what do you see as the biggest obstacle at the moment in CIE, biggest obstacle to embedding these relational and dynamic conceptions of space and time? We know of a lot of work on this topic. You mentioned several colleagues of ours who have done a lot of very important work, but still, what remains the biggest obstacle? What do you think?
Oh gosh, that's a hard question. I think sometimes these ideas scare people off. It's much easier to think about space and time using those old meta narratives. You go in, you study a classroom in one place, you study a classroom in another place, you compare them. That's pretty straightforward, and a lot of our research has been like that in our field, and so I think this idea of engaging with spatial theorizing and the spatial turn is a challenge. It's sort of, and it is more difficult. Some of the questions that I've had today allude to the challenges of mapping changes over time. We are called upon to study educational systems uh, at a particular point in time. It's the nature of our work and what we do. And yet those systems are always changing. They're always in flux. And so how do you fix them at a point in order to study them when they are changing and in flux all of the time? It's a problem that I think educational and other social science scholars have always faced, but I think it's even more relevant today, given the kind of world that we exist in, that is changing so rapidly. And we saw that very clearly with the pandemic, where how learning took place had to change extremely rapidly. And that posed challenges for researchers to be able to pivot as well very quickly to studying these new spaces of learning in during the pandemic.
Great, absolutely. We have now Assad, who I would like to invite to ask the questions, and we will finish with those. Assad, would you like to come in?
Yes, please. Thank you, Maya, and thank you, Marianne, for the amazing, wonderful presentation. My name is Assad. I'm from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, at the University of Toronto in Canada. My question's about, to what extent would you say complexity theories in general, so chaos theory or CDSD or complex adaptive systems, dynamic systems, would be helpful in understanding the inherent complexities and the ever-evolving relationship and nature of time and space? And is there any scholarship that you would recommend to very early career researchers like myself? Thank you.
Oh, such exciting work. I love it. In my master's, I read a book, I think by Glick, on chaos theory, and wrote a paper on educational reform from a chaos theory perspective. I think, and this is something I would like to do a little bit more, sort of as next steps in thinking about spatial theories, because chaos theories, at least the little bit that I know and remember and have thought about, is also looking at systems and the components of those systems, and certainly engaging with change within those systems, and the idea that systems, educational systems, for example, are not predictable. The sort of modernist conceptions that I talked about earlier, linear, universal, predictable is another sort of component of a modernist idea about education. And chaos and complexity theories challenge that. And they cause us to look at, again, if I remember correctly, disorder, chaos within a system. And I think I don't have that much more to say about it other than I think it's an exciting line of research and I would love to see more of it. Anybody that has been in a classroom knows that chaos is often the norm, and yet there's not a lot of attention paid to that in our research, at least in the research that I have looked at. I know less about complexity theory, so I would welcome if you'd like to share something with me about that. But I think that the notion of things within a system changing and moving and being in flux in chaos theory is very similar, if not the same, as what we talk about in spatial theory, but also paying attention to those components of the systems that we study that are part of disorder or chaos or random or unexpected. I think that that's a very exciting line of research. So please share with me what you're doing. I'd love to learn more.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It was a really thought-provoking presentation. There is so much there, especially for the students who are being familiarized with these theories. I believe it will be a very useful resource also as a recording on our YouTube channel. I'm very grateful that you found time to speak with us today. It was a great pleasure and honor to host you today. And I would like to thank everyone who has joined in, especially those who asked questions, although you could not join in using audio or video, but that was great to have you here and to have your questions. Thank you, everyone, and hopefully you can join our future seminars. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.